Orphan sold bread for a penny, until the sheriff saw his wife's ring. The town had no name worth remembering. It sat low in the valley, like something the desert had swallowed and spit back out, too dry to digest. The buildings leaned into each other, as if they were tired of standing alone. The saloon doors creaked even when no wind blew. The general store sold flour and nails and little else. And the people who lived there moved through their days like shadows, present but not really seen. The boy was one of those shadows. He appeared every morning at the edge of the main street, just past the livery stable where the horses stood quiet in their stalls. He carried a wooden crate under one thin arm, filled with bread wrapped in old cloth. Day-old loaves from the baker, who pitied him enough to sell them cheap, but not enough to ask where he slept at night. The boy never spoke unless spoken to. He never smiled. He just stood there with his crate, his bare feet dusty, his clothes too big for his narrow frame, and waited. People passed him without looking. A rancher's wife bought a loaf and dropped a penny into his open palm without meeting his eyes. A cowboy on his way to the saloon tossed him a nickel and took 2 loaves, more out of habit than kindness. The boy folded the coins into a small cloth pouch tied to his belt and said nothing. His voice, when it did come, was barely louder than the wind that swept through the empty alleys. No one asked his name. No one wondered where he came from. He was just the boy who sold bread for pennies. And in a town like this, that was enough to be forgotten. Sheriff Tom Bridger had seen the boy before. He'd passed him 100 times on his way to the jailhouse or the post office or the edge of town where the graves sat under a crooked cottonwood tree. Tom was a man who noticed things. It was part of the job, but the boy had never stood out to him. Not until that Wednesday morning in late September, when the light came slanting through the dust in a way that made everything look older than it was. Tom had been walking back from a livery, his boots heavy on the dry planks of the sidewalk, his hat pulled low against the early sun. He was thinking about the fence that needed mending on his property. He was thinking about the letter he needed to write to his brother in Kansas. He was thinking about anything except the boy. But then he stopped. Something caught his eye, a flicker of silver at the boy's throat. Tom turned slowly, squinting against the brightness. The boy was standing in his usual spot, his crate balanced on one hip, his head down. And there, hanging from a frayed piece of cord around his neck, was a ring. A small, delicate silver ring, with a single pale stone set into the band. Tom's chest tightened. He knew that ring. He had placed it on his wife's finger the day they married, in front of a preacher and 6 witnesses in a church that no longer stood. He had held her hand when she was dying 3 years ago, in the room upstairs above the general store where they had built their life together. And he had buried her with that ring still on her finger beneath the cottonwood tree on the hill, because she had asked him to. Because it was hers. Because it was all she wanted to take with her. Tom's boots moved before his mind caught up. He crossed the street in 4 long strides, his shadow falling over the boy like a storm cloud. The boy looked up, startled, his eyes wide and gray and full of something Tom couldn't name yet. Fear, maybe. Or guilt. Where did you get that? Tom's voice was low, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that made men confess things they hadn't planned to say. The boy didn't answer. His hand moved instinctively to the ring, covering it with his thin fingers, as if he could hide it now that it had been seen. I asked you a question, boy. Tom stepped closer. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was a sheriff, and sheriffs knew how to make silence uncomfortable. That ring. Where'd you get it? The boy's lips parted, but no sound came out. His gaze dropped to the dirt. His fingers tightened around the silver band. Tom crouched down, bringing himself to the boy's level. Up close, he could see the bruises on the boy's arms, old ones, faded yellow and green. He could see the way his ribs pressed against his shirt. He could see the tremble in his hands. I'm not going to hurt you, Tom said, softer now. But I need to know. That ring belonged to someone important to me. The boy's throat worked as he swallowed. His voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. I found it. Where? The boy's eyes flicked up just for a moment, and Tom saw something in them that made his stomach turn. Not defiance. Not innocence either. Something worse. Shame. In the ground, the boy said. Tom's blood went cold. What ground? The boy didn't answer. He didn't need to. Tom could see it in the way the boy's shoulders hunched, the way his breathing quickened, the way he looked like he wanted to disappear into the dust and never be found again. Tom stood slowly, his hands flexing at his sides. His mind was racing, but his body felt heavy, like the earth had pulled him down and wouldn't let go. He looked at the ring again, still hanging from the boy's neck, catching the light in a way that felt wrong. Sacred things weren't meant to shine in the street. They weren't meant to be worn by strangers. You dug her up, Tom said. It wasn't a question. The boy flinched. Tom took a breath, and it felt like swallowing glass. He didn't know what to feel yet. Anger, grief, disbelief. They were all tangled together in his chest like barbed wire. He wanted to grab the boy by the collar and demand answers. He wanted to ride out to the cemetery and see for himself. He wanted to turn back time and bury his wife deeper, somewhere the world couldn't reach her. But he didn't do any of those things. Instead, he just stood there, staring at the boy who had stolen from the dead, and wondered how a child so small could carry something so heavy. And the boy, for his part, looked up at the sheriff with eyes that held no fight left in them. Only the quiet, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would finally ask him why. Tom didn't go to the cemetery often. Once a month, maybe twice if the guilt sat heavy enough on his chest to pull him out there. It wasn't that he didn't love Clara. He had loved her more than he knew how to say, but standing over her grave made the loss real in a way that daily life didn't. As long as he stayed busy, as long as he kept moving through his duties as sheriff, he could pretend she was just away somewhere, visiting family, tending to something in another town. But at the grave, under that cottonwood tree on the hill, there was no pretending. She was gone, and he was alone. The ride out took 20 minutes on his mare, a steady chestnut horse named Ember who knew the way without being told. The path wound up through scrub grass and red clay, past clusters of sage that smelled sharp in the heat. The cemetery sat on the highest point overlooking the town, a small patch of ground surrounded by a low wooden fence that had started to lean with age. Maybe 15 graves in all, some marked with carved stones, others with wooden crosses that the wind and rain had worn smooth. Clara's was near the back, beneath the only tree. Tom dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He took off his hat and held it against his chest, a habit more than a choice. The cottonwood's leaves whispered overhead, silver green and restless even when the air felt still. He stood there for a long moment, looking down at the mound of dirt that had settled and hardened over 3 years. Wildflowers grew at the edges now, small yellow blooms that Clara would have liked. The grave looked untouched. Tom stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. He crouched down and ran his hand over the surface. The earth was packed solid, sun-baked and cracked in places. No sign of digging, no loose soil. No tools left behind. He leaned in, studying the headstone, a simple marker with her name and the years she'd lived carved into the pale stone. Clara Bridger. Beloved wife. 1848 to 1882. Everything looked the way it always had. But the ring was gone. Tom closed his eyes and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He wanted to believe the boy had lied, that the ring had come from somewhere else. That maybe it just looked like Clara's, and his grief-drunk mind had convinced him otherwise. But he knew better. He had looked into that boy's eyes. He had seen the weight of something shameful sitting there, heavy as stone. The boy had been here. Tom stood and turned back toward town, his jaw tight, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He didn't mount his horse. He just walked, leading Ember by the reins, his mind churning with questions that had no good answers. By the time he reached the edge of the main street, the sun had climbed higher, and the heat pressed down on him like a hand. He found the boy in the same place he always was, standing with his crate, head down, silent. Tom walked up to him without a word, and the boy looked up, startled. The fear was immediate, bright and sharp in his gray eyes. He took a step back, his thin body tensing like a rabbit that had just heard the snap of a twig. "Don't run," Tom said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you, but you and I need to talk." The boy didn't move. His fingers clutched the edges of the crate so hard his knuckles went white. Tom gestured toward the alley beside the general store. "Come on." "Not here." The boy hesitated, then followed. His steps were small and careful, like he was walking on broken glass. They moved into the shade of the alley, away from the eyes of the townsfolk who had started to notice the sheriff standing too close to the orphan boy. Tom leaned against the wall, arms crossed, and waited. The boy set his crate down and stood there, trembling. "I went to the grave," Tom said. "It looks untouched." The boy nodded slightly, but said nothing. "So how'd you get the ring?" The boy's lips pressed together. His breathing quickened. "I'm not asking again," Tom said, and his voice was harder now. Not cruel, but firm. The voice of a lawman who'd spent years pulling truth out of men who didn't want to give it. The boy's voice came out in a whisper. "I filled it back in." Tom felt something cold slide through his chest. "You what?" "I filled it back in," the boy repeated, louder this time, his words rushing together like water over stones. "I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want her to be. I didn't want it to look wrong. So I filled it back, packed it down, made it look the same." Tom pushed off the wall and stepped closer. "You dug up my wife's grave." The boy flinched, his whole body shrinking inward. "I didn't mean to, you dug her up." Tom's voice cracked, and he hated the sound of it. He hated that this child, this starving, broken child, could make him feel like the ground had opened up beneath him. "Why? What were you looking for?" "I wasn't looking for anything." The boy's voice broke and tears spilled down his cheeks. I needed what? Gold? Money? You think people bury treasure with the dead out here?" "No." The boy shook his head violently. I needed to not be so hungry." Tom stopped. The boy wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing dirt across his cheek. His words came out in gasps now, like he'd been holding them in too long and couldn't keep them down anymore. "I heard people talking. At the saloon. They said sometimes folks bury things with their people. Coins. Jewelry. Things worth something. I didn't know if it was true. But I was so hungry. And no one was giving me work. And the baker said he couldn't give me any more bread unless I paid him first. And I thought maybe." He trailed off, his shoulders shaking. Tom felt something twist inside him. Anger. Pity. Disgust. Grief. He didn't know which one to hold on to. "So you took a ring," Tom said flatly. The boy nodded, his head hanging low. "But I didn't sell it. I couldn't. When I saw her, when I opened the—" He stopped, his voice choking. "She looked peaceful. And the ring was so small. And I thought maybe she'd understand. Maybe she'd want someone to have it. Someone who needed it." Tom turned away, his hand going to his face. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to imagine this boy's hands on Clara's grave, on her coffin, on her body. But the boy wasn't finished. "There was something else," the boy said quietly. Tom looked back at him. The boy reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and worn at the edges. He held it out with both hands, like an offering. "She left this. Inside. With her. It has your name on it." Tom stared at the paper. His name, written in Clara's careful, slanted handwriting, sat on the outside fold. He didn't take it right away. He just stood there, looking at the last thing his wife had ever written, wondering what words she'd carried into the ground that he'd never been meant to find. Tom didn't read the letter right away. He carried it home in his coat pocket, folded and heavy, like carrying a stone. He walked past the jailhouse, where his deputy nodded at him through the window. He walked past the saloon, where men were already drinking even though the sun hadn't set. He walked past the church with its crooked steeple and the bakery, where the boy bought his day-old bread. He kept his eyes forward and his jaw tight, and he didn't stop until he reached the small house at the edge of town, the one he'd built with his own hands 7 years ago, back when Clara was still alive and the future felt like something worth planning for. The house was quiet. It had been quiet for 3 years. Tom stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The furniture sat exactly where it had always been: the table, the chairs, the rocking chair by the window where Clara used to sit with her sewing. He'd kept everything the same. He told himself it was respect. But maybe it was just easier than admitting she was really gone. He lit the lantern on the table and sat down heavily in the chair that faced the window. Outside, the desert was turning gold in the fading light. The sky stretched wide and empty, the way it always did out here. A place where a man could see for miles and still feel lost. Tom pulled the letter from his pocket and set it on the table in front of him. His name stared back at him in Clara's handwriting. Neat. Careful. The way she did everything. He didn't want to open it. Part of him wanted to burn it, to bury it again, to let the past stay buried where it belonged. But another part of him, the part that had loved her, the part that still whispered her name in the dark, needed to know what she'd said, what she'd written in those final days when he wasn't there. He unfolded the paper slowly, his hand steadier than he expected. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear. My dearest Tom, if you are reading this, then I am gone. And if you are reading this, then someone opened my grave, which means I was right to leave this with me, because I knew you would never look for it otherwise. I don't have much time left. The doctor says maybe a week. Maybe less. I didn't tell you how bad it was because you were already carrying so much. You've always carried so much, Tom. The town. The badge. The weight of keeping everyone safe. I didn't want to add to that, so I kept it to myself. I thought I was being strong, but now I think maybe I was just being proud. I want you to know that I forgive you. I forgive you for the long nights at the jailhouse when I waited for you to come home. I forgive you for the silence that grew between us, the kind that happens when two people stop saying the small things because they think the big things are more important. I forgive you for the distance, for the walls you built around yourself because you thought that's what a lawman had to do, for forgetting, sometimes, that I was still here. But Tom, I need you to forgive yourself too. I know you. I know you'll blame yourself when I'm gone. You'll think you should have done more, said more, been more. But you gave me everything you knew how to give, and I loved you for it, even when you were far away, even when you couldn't see me. I loved you. There's so much I wish we'd said. So many mornings I wish we'd spent just sitting together, not talking, just being. But we didn't. And now it's too late. So I'm saying it here, in this letter, hoping that somehow you'll hear it. Live, Tom. Don't let grief turn you into stone. Don't let the silence win. And if you ever find yourself alone in that house we built, remember that I was happy there. With you. Even in the quiet. Even at the end. I'll be waiting for you, somewhere on the other side of the dust. All my love. Clara. Tom set the letter down and stared at it for a long time. The lantern flickered. The shadows moved across the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like something trying to get in. He felt something break inside him, not loud, not sudden, but slow and deep, like a dam cracking under too much weight. All the things he'd buried. All the things he'd refused to feel. They came pouring out now, filling the empty space in his chest until he couldn't breathe. She had been sick, and he hadn't known. She had been dying, and he hadn't seen it. She had been alone, and he had let her be. He pressed his palms against his eyes and let out a sound that was half sob, half exhale. It had been 3 years since she died, and he'd never cried. Not at the funeral. Not at the grave. Not in the nights that followed when the house felt too big and the silence felt too loud. He told himself that sheriffs didn't cry. That men didn't cry. That grief was something you carried quietly, like a scar you didn't show anyone. But here, alone in the house they'd built together, with her words still warm in his hands, he let himself break. When the tears finally stopped, the room felt different. Lighter, somehow. Or maybe he just felt emptier. Tom picked up the letter again and read it once more, slower this time, letting each word sink in. She had forgiven him. She had loved him. And she had wanted him to live. He thought about the boy, the orphan with no name and no home, who sold bread for pennies and slept God knows where. The boy who had dug up Clara's grave not out of malice, but out of desperation. The boy who had taken the ring, but hadn't sold it. Who had worn it around his neck like a promise, like a prayer. Tom thought about what the boy had said in the alley. She looked peaceful. And then he thought about something else the boy had said, something that had gotten lost in the anger and the shock. The only soul who had sat beside her grave and spoken to her when no one else did. Tom's chest tightened. The boy had visited Clara, had talked to her, had kept her company in death the way Tom hadn't in life. He stood slowly, folding the letter carefully and placing it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. He looked around the empty house, at the chair where Clara used to sit, at the table where they used to eat, at the bed where she used to sleep beside him. And for the first time in 3 years, he understood what she'd been trying to tell him. The silence wasn't her fault. It was his. And if he didn't do something now, it would swallow him whole. Tom picked up his hat, placed it on his head, and walked out into the twilight. He didn't know what he was going to say to the boy. He didn't know how to fix what had been broken, but he knew he had to try, because the boy wasn't his enemy. He was the mirror Tom had been too afraid to look into. Tom found the boy just after sunset, curled up in the narrow space between the livery stable and the feed store. He wasn't sleeping. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, his arms wrapped around his knees. The wooden crate sat beside him, empty now. The bread was gone. Sold or eaten, Tom didn't know. The boy looked up when Tom's shadow fell across him, and the fear returned to his face, quick and sharp, like a match struck in the dark. "I'm not here to arrest you," Tom said quietly. The boy didn't move. Tom crouched down, his knees cracking slightly, and rested his forearms on his thighs. He looked at the boy for a long moment, really looked at him. The dirt on his face. The hollow places under his eyes. The way his clothes hung loose on a frame that should have been stronger, fuller, fed. "What's your name?" Tom asked. The boy hesitated. "Samuel." "How old are you, Samuel?" 10. Maybe 11. "I don't know for sure." Tom nodded slowly. "You got any family?" Samuel shook his head. "Where do you sleep?" "Wherever I can." Tom let out a breath and looked down at his hands. They were rough, scarred from years of work, sheriffing, building, fixing fences, digging graves. Hands that had done a lot of things, but never held a child of his own. He and Clara had wanted one. They'd tried, but it hadn't happened. And then she got sick, and the wanting turned into grieving, and the grieving turned into silence. He looked back at Samuel. "You can't stay out here." The boy's eyes widened slightly, but he said nothing. "Come on," Tom said, standing. He held out his hand. Samuel stared at it like it was a trap. "I'm not going to hurt you," Tom said again, softer this time. "I'm taking you home." Samuel's lips parted, but no words came out. Slowly, carefully, he reached up and took Tom's hand. His fingers were small and cold, and they trembled in Tom's grip. The house felt different with someone else in it. Tom led Samuel inside and lit the lantern on the table. The boy stood just inside the door, his eyes darting around the room like he was cataloging escape routes. Tom didn't blame him. A lifetime on the streets taught a child to never trust a closed door. "You hungry?" Tom asked. Samuel nodded. Tom went to the cupboard and pulled out what he had: bread, a bit of dried meat, some cheese that was starting to harden at the edges. He set it on the table and gestured for Samuel to sit. The boy moved slowly, like he was afraid the chair might disappear if he sat too fast. He ate quickly, barely chewing, his hands shaking as he tore into the food. Tom watched him and felt something twist in his chest. Clara would have known what to do. She would have known what to say. But Tom was just a sheriff, a man who'd spent his life enforcing the law, not raising children. He didn't know how to be soft. He didn't know how to be gentle. But he could try. When Samuel finished eating, Tom showed him the small room at the back of the house. It had been meant for a child once, painted pale blue, with a bed that had never been slept in and a window that looked out over the desert. Tom had kept the door closed for 3 years. But now he opened it, and the air that came out smelled faintly of paint and dust and lost dreams. "You can sleep here," Tom said. Samuel looked at the bed like it was something out of a story. "Really, really." The boy stepped inside, his bare feet quiet on the wooden floor. He touched the edge of the bed with one hand, testing it, making sure it was real. Then he looked back at Tom, and there were tears in his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" Samuel whispered. Tom didn't have a good answer, not one that made sense in words. So he just said, "Because someone should have done it a long time ago." The days that followed were slow and careful, like two people learning to walk together without stumbling. Tom didn't push. He didn't ask questions Samuel wasn't ready to answer. He just let the boy exist in the space they now shared. He made sure there was food on the table. He made sure the boy had clean clothes, hand-me-downs from the general store that the owner's wife had offered when she heard what the sheriff was doing. He made sure Samuel knew he could stay. And slowly, Samuel began to believe it. Tom taught him small things. How to read, using Clara's old books that still sat on the shelf by the window. How to write his name in careful letters on a piece of scrap paper. How to care for a horse, brushing down Ember in the morning while the sun came up over the hills. Samuel was quiet, but he listened. And when he smiled, rare and fragile as it was, Tom felt something in him start to heal. One evening, as they sat at the table after supper, Samuel looked up at Tom and asked, "Did you love her? Your wife?" Tom's hand stilled on his coffee cup. "Yes." "Do you still?" "Every day." Samuel nodded, like that made sense to him. Then, after a long pause, he said, "I used to talk to her. At the grave. I didn't know her, but I liked being there. It felt less lonely." Tom's throat tightened. "What did you say to her?" "I told her about my day. About the bread I sold. About the people I saw. I told her I was sorry no one came to visit her much." Samuel looked down at his hands. "I didn't mean to take the ring. I wanted to remember her. Because she made me feel like I wasn't invisible." Tom reached across the table and put his hand on Samuel's. "You're not invisible. Not anymore." Sunday came quiet and clear, the kind of morning where the sky stretched wide and blue, and the wind carried the smell of sage and earth. Tom and Samuel rode out to the cemetery together, side by side on Ember. Samuel sat in front, his hands gripping the saddle horn, his face turned into the breeze. When they reached the top of the hill, Tom helped him down, and they walked together to Clara's grave beneath the cottonwood tree. The silver ring was in Tom's pocket, carefully wrapped in a clean cloth. He knelt down and placed it on the headstone, right where her name was carved. The metal caught the light, glinting softly in the morning sun. "She would have liked you," Tom said quietly. Samuel looked up at him. "You think so?" "I know so." They stood there together, the sheriff and the orphan, neither one alone anymore. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves, whispering secrets only the dead could hear. And for the first time in 3 years, Tom felt like he could breathe again. He looked down at Samuel, and Samuel looked back at him, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not a promise, not a vow, just an understanding. That grief could be shared, that loneliness could be broken, that two people who had lost everything could still find something worth holding on to. The town noticed. People saw the boy walking beside the sheriff now, clean and fed, and no longer selling bread from a wooden crate. They saw him sitting on the porch of Tom's house in the evenings, reading by lamplight. They saw the way Tom's face had changed, softer, somehow, less haunted. The widow who ran the boarding house started nodding at Samuel when he passed. The rancher who used to ignore him tipped his hat. The baker gave him a fresh loaf instead of day-old bread and refused payment. The boy who had been invisible was seen. And in seeing him, the town began to see each other again. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person choosing kindness over silence. One person deciding that the past doesn't have to be the end of the story. One person reaching out a hand and saying, "You don't have to be alone." Tom didn't know if he'd ever stop missing Clara. He didn't know if the ache in his chest would ever fully go away. But he knew this. In saving Samuel, he had saved himself. And that was enough. For now, it was enough.